Hello. If you're just starting to join, welcome to this wacky and spooky Weatherization Wednesday. If you're just joining us, you may notice that you are being greeted in a very Halloween themed edition by myself, Becca White. I am a Weatherization unicorn today. I can magically answer any weatherization question. And if I don't have the answer, we're going to introduce you to two fabulous folks who will have the answer. We also have a creature to my left, Daniel Shearer in costume. So happy Halloween, folks. This is an air sealing, insulation, weatherization Q&A. And I'm going to share my screen to talk a little bit about our partners and then introduce our wonderful co-hosts today. So let me just get that started. But thank you so much for taking the time to join. And we're going to be doing a relatively informal Weatherization Wednesday today. So it's great if you've come with specific questions for this Halloween edition. So at Button Up Vermont, we're a partner-driven organization, a campaign, and we've got all of our utility partners on board. We've got multiple partners in the energy nonprofit space, and our weatherization agencies are a part of this campaign, our community action agencies. There's one in your region. And then we've also got all of the regional planning commissions. So to really highlight the fact that we've got so many great partners, I wanted to take a moment and just thank them and thank you for joining us. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we can start today to talk about weatherization. So with the Halloween theme, what we've heard loud and clear from different community members is they wanted an opportunity to ask a question to an energy consultant, someone who could potentially answer a question for them about their home. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to be interspersing some interesting spooky photos throughout. So if you have a question, please go ahead and start typing that out. And I'll start by introducing Bruce Courteau and Matt Sargent, who are both here today with us. They're energy consultants from Efficiency Vermont. And you can see Matt's waving. And there's Bruce. And you are more than welcome to start putting questions in the chat with your specific questions around maybe home projects or weatherization. And as you're doing that, I'm just going to do two quick slides on what weatherization is, really high level, as we start to get some questions. And you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A section. So as your Halloween themed Weatherization Wednesday, I maybe should have shifted up the the slides from being a sweater and a windbreaker, but the truth is that is the best analogy that I found for what weatherization means. When we Matt might have a better one. We'll
go with yours. It's very nice.
So let's say you have a sweater on and you walk outside. Those cable knits, you might have air blowing through them. So insulation like your sweater is great, but you also want to have air sealing like a windbreaker when you're outside, because it keeps that hot air in and doesn't let cold air flow through. So when you're thinking about your home and building science, we want to make sure that we're prioritizing both insulation and air sealing for comfort and savings. On top of that, when we think about building science and how our homes function, there's something called the stack effect. So as hot air rises and comes out of leaks or holes in your upper stories or your attic, or even maybe a window, for example, you actually are then also sucking cold air out of the leaks in the basement or out of the lower levels. And that's called the stack effect. So when you button up, you reduce that and you stop the stack effect from happening. So I'm going to go look in the chat and see if we have a question. And We do. So we can jump in and answer that to get the ball rolling. So it looks like Matt has already jumped in the chat to respond, but I'll just ask the question to this group. Allison asks, will blowing in more insulation in the attic be effective if it's not evaluated and air sealed first? So yeah, how about we jump
Yeah,
into
I
that
can
one?
elaborate on that a little bit if you want.
Go ahead.
Sure. So like if we just add insulation in our attic and we don't peel back the layers of the existing insulation and do some air sealing, Becca was just describing the stack effect, how air gets heated in the home, and then because it's warmer, it rises. And as it rises, it forces it, it creates like a high pressure at the top of the building and forces itself through any little gaps and cracks in the top of the building. And that's how it's constantly leaking into the attic. So we need to stop that before we put an insulation cap on the top, because it'll still leak right through the new insulation. And then we have all this new insulation in the way, and it's harder to air seal the attic afterwards. So we definitely want to evaluate and air seal the attic first. Also, we want to check for stuff in the attic, like vermiculite insulation and things like that, or knob and tube wiring, or some other factors that we might have to correct first before we add insulation.
Becca has a slide. Becca, bring up that slide you showed.
Yeah. So something that's very
That's
scary.
scary.
Yeah.
This is what happens when you don't check what's going on in the attic and you just go ahead and insulate.
Yeah. So is this the knob and tube right here?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. And what's the danger with having, if I just said, hey, we're going to insulate and I still had knob and tube?
What do you think, Bruce? You want to talk about that, or you want me to take that?
Go ahead, Matt. But there's certainly a fire concern, that's for sure.
There's a fire concern. So these wires run in parallel. So one is the hot wire and one is the neutral or ground wire. And anything that touches across those two wires can short them out and create an arcing or a fire hazard. So we've put all this insulation, now we've covered it up. So now nobody can see where those wires are, and somebody could step or trip on them or place something on them, or another way, short them out somehow. So that's the real danger. Also, this stuff is really old. So it could just be super brittle, and left alone, it's probably okay. But when we start messing with it, we can create problems. So best if you find it up there and you want to insulate your attic, to have an electrician come and look at it and replace it with modern wiring.
Okay.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is sometimes we actually run into places where it gets disconnected somewhere else, and they sort of leave this sometimes simply because it's cost effective. And it's really the kind of thing that needs to be determined by an electrician. I mean, if you stumble onto something, you should really have it checked out, or somehow verify the fact that it's no longer in service. And so it's not uncommon to find it still there, because it just doesn't it doesn't get torn out. It just gets disconnected somewhere. So that's the kind of thing you need to find out.
So you're saying it could be there, but just not hot. So it's not a problem. Yep.
Good to know. And we've actually got another question. Lori has asked us, how can we minimize sweating on the inside of our windows? We've tried plastic on the inside, which didn't work very well. We also have older aluminum frame storm windows.
So oftentimes what's happening is the surface of the glass has reached the dew point. And so any vapor that's in the air is turning from a gas to a liquid. And so you can either warm the glass, or you can reduce the relative humidity in the building from a sort of science point of view. From a practical point of view, if there's, oftentimes we start looking for sources of moisture. And sometimes it's a good idea to get an idea of what the relative humidity is in the building, to see if in fact your building is running more moist than you may think it is. Building and moisture do not get along very well. Humans and moisture get along better. So sometimes it's sort of a difference between comfort and a trade-off. But in that particular situation, I guess the first thing to do would be to decide how much relative humidity there is in the building. Is it unique to one part of the building? one side of the building that could be running colder. Oftentimes you see it sometimes when you isolate a room, close the door and deny heat to like an upstairs bedroom in the wintertime. You may see condensation happen there because now the room's running cooler and then that surface of the glass is running cooler. Sometimes people actually give that aluminum storm window a bad rap. It's the triple track storm. There's tons of them out there. If in fact they're in place and they're functioning properly, a storm does have some effect. So don't necessarily throw the storm out. Find out if it's functioning properly. There's screens associated with them. I mean, from a practical point of view, they can be quite effective, but they need to be functioning properly. So those would be the things I look in. And Matt, you could certainly chime in. You have a lot of experience in existing homes.
Yeah, I'm about to chime in. Let me think where I want to start. So the triple track storm that Bruce mentioned, the storm window on the outside, any storm window on the outside has got to have weep holes at the bottom as a place to just let that storm breathe a little bit, and any condensation that runs down the inside face of the storm has a place to get out at the bottom. So sometimes those weep holes can get plugged up with just junk and bugs and what have you, and it's good to like find them and clean them up. Also, it's good to take care of the weather stripping that's around the primary window, because you don't want the humid air to be leaking out the window and condensing on the inside face of the storm. And once you've done those two things, it really is good. What Bruce said about measuring the relative humidity in that space is spot on, because like you don't know what's causing the problem until you take some measurements. Now you can go down to the hardware store and get a pretty inexpensive little, battery powered portable meter that reads relative humidity and temperature. And I think that's a great thing to put like on the windowsill, because then you'll know like what factors are causing the condensation. Is it because it's too cold, or is it because my humidity is too high? Typically we want to see buildings running at about 40% relative humidity in the wintertime. If you have a really drafty house, it'll probably be lower than that. And if you have a tight house or a high moisture load of something, Bruce, the things that cause moisture in houses, right? Wet basements, lack of ventilation, like no bathroom fans or things like that.
Dirt floors in basement, big time. If there's any exposed soil in the basement, that really needs to be covered. There's a huge amount of moisture in dirt.
The ground's like 100% humidity, right? So like that's going to show up on your windows. If that's interacting with the air in your house, you'll see it on your windows.
Well, that slide that Becca showed earlier, that slide that Becca showed earlier, where the cold air is being sucked in at the basement. So if you have a dirt floor in the basement, that moisture is being transported up into the up through the building into the top of the building. Yeah.
Back to the stack effect again. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I just learned a lot from that question alone. Thank you both. And I have a few photos that could go along with that. Some creepy basement floor photos I'll show. But I'll start by, we got another question. Folks are really interested in asking you questions, so I'm excited to dive in some more. We have a question from Brad. He's heard that weatherizing his basement is important, but that with heat rising, why would he weatherize his basement? And what does it even mean when we say weatherizing a basement?
Well, that goes right back to that stack effect picture again. And what's happening is, so the air in the building is being heated up, and because it's now warm, it's rising, right? So it rises up and escapes out the top of the building, and more air, the building's trying to reach equilibrium. So you can see the blue arrows at the bottom is where the cold air leaks into the basement. And then it gets sucked up into the house, heated up, and then pushed out the attic due to the stack effect. So that's why we go after basements and attics. So attics keep the air from leaking out, and basements keep the air from leaking in. So we want to do air sealing in the basement. We want to put a good airtight insulated door at the bulkhead entrance, the outdoor entrance to the basement. We want to seal up around those old basement windows, maybe put a storm panel on them, make sure that they're airtight. We want to air seal the whole joist perimeter area, including the sill and the band joist area of the home. We want to air seal the foundation where it meets the sill. So that's the air sealing part. And then insulating, we want to, once we've air sealed, then we can go ahead and insulate all those exterior areas like the basement. You know, if you have a 8-inch concrete wall, here's a little true fact for you. An 8-inch concrete basement wall is about R1. It's about the same as a single pane piece of glass. So you've got this like conductor instead of insulator under, you know, between the ground and where the floor joists are, which is usually about a foot or a foot and a half around the entire perimeter of your building. You've got this cold surface. So that's making your basement really cold, and that air leaks in around through that cold surface. It's wicked cold. And so it's just coming up and it's creating this, this cycle. So that's why we go after weatherizing basements. Not so much because we want to make it super warm in the basement, but we just want to keep that cold air from leaking in, and we want to warm up those cold surfaces as much as we can.
And I just switched over to a photo that we have, which is a spooky basement, which in part shows exactly what you're talking about, where your basement is a place that you want to really take a look at when it comes to weatherizing. And Bruce, you mentioned something earlier that I didn't even, with my layman's eyes, notice. I was focusing on this creepy piano, but you pointed out a really big,
a big hole there.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that as we think about basements.
Well, just chiming back with what Matt was saying, you know, sometimes I try not to make any assumptions what people know about air sealing and insulating. And Matt was mentioning R value. So R value is the resistance to heat loss. And the greater the R value, the greater the resistance. There is the Residential Energy Building Code in the state of Vermont, which has some information about different assemblies. And so right now, a basement in the state of Vermont from the Energy Code should be R15. So when Matt was we're talking about R1, you can sort of see how what a Herculean leap it is to get from R1 to R15, and that theoretically is sort of the most the sort of weakest R value that you should have in your basement in the state of Vermont if you're going to meet the energy code. So just so sometimes people don't fully I mean, when I go to the dentist and he says, you know, you need a filling on R17 in the back, I have no idea what he's talking about, but I just agree with it. So sometimes people don't really understand what R value is, and that's sort of some background on that as well. I think the point on this slide is that, hey, there's an abandoned chimney. Going back to chimney effect, you know, the term, right? So in essence, that if in fact that's not sealed up, it has the potential to pull all that cool air out of the basement and just rocket it up through the chimney and just exaggerate that pulling of cold air around the foundation that Matt was just talking about.
I have seen, and this is a scary thing, I have seen where old fireplaces like that, or even there's enough bypasses through like maybe balloon framed walls or something, so much air being sucked out of the basement by the stack effect of the house that the basement was at such a low pressure that the chimney was backdrafting. So like the heating system couldn't establish a draft, so that the combustion gases were leaking into the basement. So yeah, I was at a building once where the heating system had been red tagged because nobody could make it draft properly. So red tagged means like the fuel dealer comes out and locks it out and says, you can't use this anymore because it's not safe. And we were able to make it draft properly simply by plugging up all the holes in the basement. That's all it needed was to, and then there's the other thing where we can plug up all the holes and make the basement too tight where the chimney won't draft. So like we need to check the draft in the chimneys. We need to know how that basement's working, what kind of pressures we're dealing with. And that's why it's great to have a certified BPI contractor, a home performance contractor, helping us with these projects, so that we know that we're safe. We're not causing bad interactions with the heating systems. We know things are going to draft properly and work right.
Great points. And we have a question from Greg on a slightly different topic, which Greg says, I have replaced a bunch of recessed cans in the attic with LED discs, which have a rubber gasket around the rim. Do they still need to be air sealed? And if so, what is the best way to air seal them?
Matt, what do you want to start?
You go ahead, Bruce. You're on it.
Okay, yeah. So the gasket's good. I guess the other thing, if you can get up into the attic up above there and see what's going on, that's be the first step. Because there could be two things going on. You could you might not have enough insulation over the top of that can that still exists. So that now you would add some more additional insulation if in fact, the top of the can's hanging out in the breeze, so to speak. Sometimes if you can't get to the attic, I replaced a bunch of my house and I actually took everything apart and reached up in there and tried to air seal. There's a metal can in there and there's little slides that allow you to adjust that old bulb that used to be in that metal can. So there's all kinds of avenues for air to travel through there. If you get a good seal on that gasket and it is a really surface mounted, then you're probably going to get rid of the majority of the air leakage that's happening through that hole in the drywall now that you've plugged it. But in my mind, I would get up in the attic and see what's going on up there to really take a look at that. And if nothing else, make sure that there's adequate insulation over the top of that old existing can to get you where you want to be.
Yeah, good point, Bruce. Those old cans were not rated for contact with insulation. So many of them weren't insulated. So there's probably a big hole, and they were like a little chimney because they had incandescent bulbs in them, which made heat, and then a hole that dumped that heat into the attic. So they were just sort of like a disaster in terms of energy efficiency. So great job on the new cans, but make sure that you've got insulation over the top of them. And also just a little background on recessed cans. A good new one is going to be rated ICAT, or Insulation Contact Airtight. So we want that ICAT rating on our new cans. And if we see that rating, then we know we can insulate and air seal right over the top of them. So if that's the case, if you're seeing that, go ahead and air seal it up with some spray foam or insulate right over the top of it. If you don't see that rating on your can, you got to pick a different approach because you can't put the insulation right up against an old can.
And as long as we're talking about attic insulation, going back to the code says R49 in flat attic, right? So if that can was no insulation or R1, you can sort of see the lift there, R1 to R49. Now I know it's a small space, but as Matt can attest, sometimes you go into houses and you starting to add the cans. And it's not uncommon to see 15 or 20 or
30 of them. Yeah.
Throughout the house. Yeah. They're a little less problematic if they're in between the first floor and the second floor. They'll still leak because they are connected to the perimeter of the building. So recessed cans are really sort of a liability from an energy point of view. And so that's sort of why they've really moved to that sort of surface mounted LED that Matt was just mentioning.
I mean, you wouldn't want to build a nice tight attic and then put 30 6-inch holes in it, right? That's like a bad idea.
Absolutely.
That's a good point.
That's a pretty scary prospect, right?
Yeah. Ooh, scary. I see we have another question about basements, but I did want to take a moment, and I'm just going to share my screen here. In part, when we were talking about this Weatherization Wednesday, something that is interesting about maybe the overlap between Halloween themes and weatherization is that we use a tool all the time in kind of this space to figure out some information about your home. And so the images I have here are from IR cameras. And I was wondering if both of you could tell us a bit about what we're seeing on this left-hand picture with this blue piece. What information would this type of photo or seeing something on an IR camera with this image, what would that show to a homeowner or an energy consultant?
Well, the temperature at the crosshairs is clearly labeled there, so that we've got 46-degree temperature underneath this. Is it a stove? Is it a kitchen stove?
I think it's a kitchen stove.
It might be a laundry appliance. Looks like a kitchen stove to me. So I'm guessing there's a hole, and it could be like the penetration where the gas line or the electric line comes in to the stove. It could be anything, but there's maybe a mouse hole or something. I don't know. Could be anything back there, but we know that there's some kind of cold air happening back there.
And it's not a ghost. we can say that it's probably some air sealing you need to do. And we did have a question that goes back to the basements conversation. Actually, we have two, so I'll start with the first, which is, what about if, and this is a question from Allison, what about if there is drywall in the basements? Can you better air seal?
That drywall is going to make it hard to get at what you need to air seal. So
Okay.
a lot of times, finished basements are tricky for that very reason. Like those finishes are covering up the stuff that we need to air seal.
But the other thing is, yeah, it could be time for some exploration to sort of see. I mean, you're talking about a finished wall, what's behind there? And one of the things that happens sometimes with existing houses is often people would put a fibrous piece of insulation against a cold concrete surface. And that's sort of typically a recipe for a moisture problem, or we don't want to be trapping moist air between fibrous insulation and the cold surface of the concrete. So to me, that would be an opportunity to do a little exploring and see what's going on back there. If it turns out that your basement is really damp and moist, that could be a source of what's going on. I mean, the more we knew, the better. But the finished basement can often be a tricky one. Sometimes if you can get into the ceiling, sometimes they do a drop ceiling, tile ceiling. If you can pop a tile and look up in there and sort of see what's going on, that may give you some indication. It'll also probably give you access to the rim joist. Matt mentioned earlier, the perimeter of the floor system. Whenever you change from one assembly to another, the concrete to the wood to the upstairs, there's a seam there. And historically, they just used a mechanical, they nailed it together or bolted it together. They didn't use the caulks and sealants and stuff that we see now in new construction. So it could give you an opportunity to get up in there and see what's going on, and that will help you to assess how to proceed in that situation.
Yeah, a lot of times I'll be able to sort of see what the deal is by looking in a closet or an unfinished area in that basement. It's pretty common that there'll be some place where you can see, how they built that stuff. Also a great place to bring in somebody with some more experience, because that is a tricky thing to get at.
Right.
There's this term called there's this term called intrusive disassembly, right? Where we like, that's a pretty scary prospect too. But you get in there and you cut out some of the sheetrock around the perimeter, and you get in there and you fix up what's there. But that's a messy, expensive kind of thing to do. So maybe there's other stuff you can do first. Maybe, in a house like that, a lot of times we'll do what we can do, and then we'll make sure we do a really good job in the attic so we don't have a lot of air leaks leaking out of the house, which is going to bring more air in down low.
And that is a great segue to our question from Lynn. Lynn asks, I live in an 1860s Vermont farmhouse, very common. Under the wood floored kitchen is just a crawl space over the dirt or the ground. Naturally, the kitchen is quite cold in the winter. What is the best way to do some insulation there? And then they have a follow-up question about the attic, but maybe we'll start with this one first.
Well, if it's under the kitchen, there's probably some plumbing there, right? So I like the concept where if you can get into the crawl space, I like the idea of insulating and air sealing the perimeter wall of the crawl space, so that brings the crawl space sort of into the thermal enclosure of the home. And also, dirt floor absolutely means putting a polyvapor barrier down. We talked about the humidity that's in the dirt, like getting into the air and moving up into the house and condensing on the windows and that stuff. So it's a great opportunity if we're down there. I like to put the poly down first because it's better than crawling around in the dirt. You can crawl around on the poly instead. And that's my preferred approach. A lot of times it's not really practical. You can't, because they're too low. You can't even get in there. So that's where you want a skinny person or a small person or a ghost to get in there and do that work for you. Bruce, what do you think?
Casper the contractor.
Yeah, totally agree with what Matt's saying. One of the things, so my sense is it's probably a stone foundation because of the age of the building. So prior to any of that sort of stuff, you really need to take a look at what's going on from a moisture. That foam or any of those products, they're not really waterproofing products, they're insulating products. And so you really need to take a look at if there's any moisture coming out. Oftentimes in old buildings like that, at the eve of the building, the water will drip and drip and drip, and it'll create this sort of swale, and it becomes, water's just trying to find the path of least resistance. And usually once it gets to the stone or it's in the basement. So you would need to really check all that out prior to any of that. You know, this is really the standard old house in Vermont major retrofit. And you know, I'm not trying to push anybody in any direction, but this is where oftentimes you need a specialized contractor. We have a bunch of them. For some reason, they like to swirl around in basements and attics and crawl spaces. So maybe these are the people you want to talk to. And oftentimes, initially, just to get the analysis, they'll come in, do the analysis. They'll tell you what your house needs. They'll tell you what the upgrades are, what it would cost, what the savings would be. They get you access to incentives. They get you access to low or no interest money. So oftentimes, that's a good place to start in a major sort of job like that. So that could be a good just intro to get in there. And like Matt says, sometimes getting access to those places can be really, really challenging.
What
Yeah,
great
so
points.
really, Bruce brought up a great point about addressing the drainage on the outside, on the exterior. That is crucial. That's one of the biggest issues I see looking around in old houses is the water coming off the roof. It just dumps right in next to the foundation, and over time it erodes itself a nice little pathway to get right in there. And these old crawl spaces were fine for a while, but a lot of times they're seeing excess moisture because of that, and that's something that can be addressed with grading on the outside of the building or gutters or any number of different ways to get at that. But that's an important step.
And since I'm not seeing any more questions, I'm just going to share my screen and show a couple of other photos that are, I think the theme of today is it's scary not to weatherize, but these are some creepy crawlies. And if you can see on the left hand, that's a spider, not a friendly spider too. And then on the right, we've got a rat that has been caught in a vent. And I thought I'd point out just the fact that when we talk about weatherization today, there's also some things you can do for energy savings and air quality. So while we're not talking about our spider friend, we might be talking about our vents, and we might also be talking about, oops, let me go other direction. We might also be talking about our dryer fans or our bathroom fans. So if either of you have thoughts on either the creepy crawlies or our very helpful fan vents, that would be some insight I'd love to hear.
Well, spiders like to build their nests where there's a natural draft, where there's convective currents, because the insects that they eat are riding those or in those currents. Sort of like fish will feed at the eddies. This is a sort of really similar concept. So cobwebs are our friend. Nasty spiders like that, and maybe not, but cobwebs really help us see air movement. So you can shine your light on the cobwebs in your basement, and if you see them moving, you know that's either the wind or the stack effect leaking into your house right there. So you can actually use those to help you locate where some air leakage is. They're very light, they blow in the wind easily. It's no fun to crawl around and get them in your face and your hair and stuff, but yeah, it's just an occupational thing. I don't know. Yeah, rodents are a bummer. This is fall, and boy, they all want to come in this time of year, right? And I'm trapping them like crazy. I'm the mighty trapper from the Great White North around here, and we have, yeah. So that's a thing. You gotta keep up with that, or the air quality starts to really deteriorate in your house. If you can smell mouse nests in your house, it's not a healthy or a good thing.
And I'll just say I forgot to follow up on the second part of Lynn's question. So maybe before we jump to anything else, I did want to note they also asked about their attic, and do people still use those big pink rolls of insulation?
Well, yes, you can buy that pink insulation at all the major places. It's still there. So air is a good insulator as long as you can't, as long as the wind's not blowing through it. And that's what the big fluffy things are doing. I guess they're keeping a blanket of air that's not moving around. And so fiberglass is a common a type of insulation. There's other types out there, cellulose and foams and all kinds of different products that are out there. It has its applications. It needs to be installed really, when you look at those, going back to that R value, all those products will have a printed R value on them typically. Those are like the best case scenarios in like Lawrence Livermore lab. I mean, it's really hard to get those kind of numbers when those products are used in the performance end of things. So with fiberglass, you really need to install it like as well as you possibly can. So there are other products that are a little more forgiving, but it is a common problem. Once again, going back to what we talked about earlier, the air sealing is as critical as the insulation. It's, I mean, in a way, it's sort of like when you prep, you do drywall and you tape and the sanding, and that's all the hard work prior to the coat of paint that happens at the end. So in a way, all the prep work on the front end will cause that insulation to work better on the back end. So that product is out there. We don't see as much of it as we used to, but it's certainly out there. It just needs to be installed properly. But once again, all the air sealing and the front end work needs to happen as well. Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Provided you've done a good job with your air sealing, your fiberglass insulation is effective. I think one of the issues with fiberglass insulation that we see is the installation of it, the install of it. So like it needs to be cut to fit around every little piece of framing, around every little building cavity. So that's where the wheels fall off the bus, because if it's cut and fit properly, it's okay. If you cut it an inch too short, you got a 1 inch gap with no insulation there. And that's often what we see, is it's just sort of stuffed. And when you compress fiberglass insulation, it loses its insulating value. Not completely, but it diminishes the value of it. So where you've stuffed it, a piece that's too big, if you stuff that into a hole that's too small, you're going to decrease the R value of it. If you cut it too short, you're going to have a big gap with no R value of it. So there's all these things add up, and at the end of the day, when you see a job, and 20% of the insulation is either too long or too short, you're 20% off the mark there. So then we have loose fill insulation products like cellulose. There's loose fit, there's blown in rock wool, there's blown in fiberglass now. And those loose insulations get into all those nooks and crannies. So you don't have to cut and fit them around stuff. So if you have irregular surfaces, maybe that's a better product to use, although a little harder on a do-it-yourself basis. Like you can't go to the lumber yard and buy cellulose insulation because you need a specialized blower to blow it in place with. So,
and
sometimes what we see is, in older houses where they do have some existing fiberglass, and if it's done well and it's in there, oftentimes they'll top it off with cellulose. They'll blow it over top of it, which sort of takes it sort of makes up for its weaknesses. It gets down between all the nooks and crannies. So that may be another option for someone who's thinking about adding insulation to an existing fiberglass job. Once again, providing that you get back to either the tops of all the recessed cans, the attic hatches, any sort of penetrations in there, address those first, put the fiberglass back in, and then blow in the cellulose.
And I'll just say oh, Daniel, or what is that?
I'll just add in that there are some hardware stores out there that if you're buying the cellulose from them, they'll include a free rental of the blower with it. So still certainly a viable DIY option.
Yeah, make sure you get in there and do that air sealing first, though. A lot of times that means like peeling back the old layers of fiberglass, a dusty, nasty, mouse-filled old layers of stuff, and air sealing underneath it. Then once you've done that, you're probably better off to get rid of the old insulation because its R value is compromised. So you got to decide how deep you're going to go. Like any remodeling project, the scary part is figuring out when to stop, because like it bleeds your bank account dry.
Wow.
Ooh,
And
there's another good Halloween.
That's the scary part one.
yeah, you vampire remodel products. Well, we've got you both have actually covered, I think, the start of the two questions that we've gotten in the meantime, which is Allison asked, what is the best type of attic insulation? Blown cellulose, fiberglass, foam? And then Mark asked a slightly different take on the question. There hasn't been a lot of talk of spray foam insulation used, or as just that, or used for air sealing. Do you recommend this procedure? So a couple questions around insulation and air sealing there.
You want to start off, Bruce?
Oh, did Bruce pause? Bruce may have frozen. Oh,
Ooh.
You're back.
there you go.
That was scary.
I was worried about you. Do you want to talk about insulation? Do you want to go first?
Well, I missed the whole question. I heard a little bit about spray foam and then everything froze. So I thought maybe I was in purgatory here. So maybe someone else can start.
Okay, so the question that I heard was, what's the best insulation to use? And I think it was like in an attic, but let's just talk about insulation for a little bit. So, some insulation like spray foam works pretty well for doing a few different things. So not only does spray foam give you an air barrier, it also gives you a vapor barrier, and it gives you a thermal barrier. So it acts as an insulator. So it's doing a few different things. That is nice if you have an irregular space. It's also a little bit higher R value per inch. So Bruce mentioned R value, resistance to heat transfer. So a higher R value has more insulating power. And spray foam might be something like R6.5 to R7 per inch. So if you have a small cavity or thin cavity, if you have a 2x4 cavity and you fill that with spray foam, you're going to get more R value in that cavity than you are if you put fiberglass in that cavity. But you can't leave spray foam exposed because it's a smoke and flame hazard. So it needs to be covered. And that can either be done with a coating that you paint on it, or by putting sheetrock or something in front of it to keep it from turning instantly into toxic smoke in case of a fire. So it's a more expensive, and spray foam is more expensive typically than the other types of insulation, and it has more greenhouse gas emissions per square foot than other types of insulation. So plant-based insulations like fiberglass or insulation are the greenest. So they're the best for the environment. And as we get into the spray foams and rigid foam insulation, they tend to be worse. So spray foam recently is switching over to using a less environmentally dangerous blowing agents, so that it's not quite so hazardous to the environment as it used to be, but still, if you stack them all up, the foam insulation products are probably going to be on the less environmentally sensitive end of things. You do need to air seal your cavities, and you do need to make sure that the wind isn't leaking through any fibrous insulation that you put in. And by fibrous, I would include fiberglass, mineral wool. There's a company called Roxol that's pretty popular. You can get that down at your building supply house. And that's a mineral wool insulation. That's pretty good stuff. But the greenest one is probably cellulose, and that needs to be blown in with specialized equipment.
And since we haven't had a lot of talk about spray foam used as just that or used for air sealing, do you recommend using spray foam for both of those things?
Well, I think it depends. It depends on what the situation is. Spray foam is a great product, and I see it used a lot on the sills and the perimeters of the basements where it's exposed, it's easy to get to, it's a big air leakage problem, and we can insulate it and air seal it easily with one spray. we're good to go. So it's a nice product for that. Spraying it on rubble walls, I think we've heard from the historic preservation that can cause problems. If anybody ever needs to work on those stone walls again, it's hard to get at those stones now once we've covered them. So perhaps you could put a membrane over the stone wall and then spray against that membrane. That might be a good call in order to be able to service that wall later in the lifetime of the building.
Great point. And yes, if you are interested in that side of things, the historic homes piece, we did a webinar earlier with the Preservation Trust of Vermont with Alex from there. And that is actually available on the Button Up website. If you weren't able to be a part of the webinar we did a few weeks ago, you can watch the recording and you'll see Matt Sargent there as well, who answered some great questions during that webinar. And I'm not seeing any more questions come in, so
I
it
want to
might
hear
be.
what Bruce has to say about insulation.
Sorry, Bruce.
I'm sure I missed a whole bunch of stuff, and he's really smart, so we should get his.
No. So it's mandatory, obviously.
Insulation is good.
Yeah. So I think once again, like Matt was saying, depending upon the situation, oftentimes, it's a combination of products. If, like the rim joist in the basement, that's a key place. People, you go do spray foam on a pretty regular basis. Sometimes in new construction with a smooth wall, they'll do a rigid foam board, and then they'll spray foam the pockets and they can drop it down onto the, there's no really, it's like Ford and Chevy, right? What's good and what's bad. The air sealing is critical. If you can use the insulating product as the air sealing, then that's a benefit because you're not going around twice. But once again, there's really no straightforward answer. And if you were to talk to like these contractors that we work with, they do any and all of the above, depending upon the situation, unless there's like a fundamental reason. There are contractors who have like drawn a line in the sand and say, hey, listen, we're not going to do spray foam, at least not at this time, because of like what Matt was saying, global warming, potentials, because of the products really. Yeah.
Okay, I just thought of something. I don't want to interrupt, but I don't want to lose my train of thought because I think it's important. People should know this. I work with a lot of builders and a lot of new construction, and a lot of people are of the opinion that because you're using spray foam insulation, you're going to have a tighter house, because we just talked about the air sealing capability of spray foam. But I measure the air leakage in a lot of homes, and I don't find them much tighter than homes that are done with fibrous insulation. And I think the reason for this is it's the details. Detailing is everything. So where the walls meet the roof, where the walls meet the floor, where the floors meet the partitions and slope ceilings, and all those intersections in the building are where the air is leaking in. And if we're just filling the cavities, we're not really addressing those intersections in the building. And those are the most important pieces. Or I don't know, they're highly critical. We got to get those right. And so if we just think if we replace fiberglass with spray foam, we're going to have a tight building, not necessarily. So it's about the details, and you got to like think it through and detail everything properly.
Absolutely.
Okay, sorry to interrupt.
No, I think it's a great point. I guess the only point I was trying to just make is that, there is no really true answer that says, hey, listen, you got to have a, Chrysler, Suburban for this job. And that there's a lot of different products out there. The products are changing. Like Matt was saying, a lot of the spray foams are moving more to the green side of things, simply because that's what the market's going to demand. The houses aren't going away. People have much, much higher expectations of their houses now than they have in the past, which is a great thing. And so you're going to see the products change in certain ways. That's a big scheme. I totally get what Matt's saying. We see it all the time. All new product. And it's like, hey, well, what's it doing? How can we get it? What does it cost? So the market is changing on a regular basis in certain ways. That's a big part of what's going on here, is just keeping up with the stuff that's coming down the into market. There's a lot of European stuff that's coming to market now. Now, once again, we're sort of in a bad scene right now because all the supply chains have been bumped. It's really hard. But in a way, that's what causes people to back up and say, hey, listen, maybe we should look at another product, or maybe we should think about doing this a little bit differently, simply because we can't get what we used to get. And it was so easy to do it in the past. It just gives you an opportunity to look at a different product or a different method of doing something. So it's constantly changing. But you can't get around the fact that you need insulation, and demands are getting more and more all the time. So.
Well, I keep thinking we're about to wrap up, but then we get more questions. Thank you both for spending so much time with us today. And we've actually got 2 questions. I'll start with the first, which is T. Levis says, I have a and this is kind of a specific thing, so I'd love to hear your suggestions. So I have a 2nd floor sunroom, all windows on 3 sides. The windows are single pane, probably put in the 1980s, and the room is freezing in the winter and too hot in the summer. Someone suggested a heat pump, but do we also need to replace the windows to keep the heat in/out?
Well, yeah. Yes and yes, I think. It's really hard to control when you have if it's overheating because there's so much sunlight. That is an issue of shading on the outside of the building. So roof overhangs and shading can help with that. Also, and you know, obviously, if we're too cold in a room surrounded by single pane glass, I think it's pretty obvious. Like, well, let's step up the glass part. Maybe having some storm panels built, some interior storm panels. Like, do you want to talk about window dressers, Becca?
Sure, yeah.
Window Dressers is a community-based organization that can come to your community and host a interior storm panel building workshop. And these storm panels are double pane, so they have a plastic film on both sides of them, and they fit from the inside into the window openings. So that might be a great sort of cost-effective way for you to build a bunch of those things and step up your game out there. But also, you even then you may still need to add a little bit of heat out there, for which I like heat pumps in the right place at the right time. What do you think, Bruce?
Well, I think first of all, you have to define what you're going to do with this space. Because if you're moving it sounds like if you want to air condition it in the summer and you want to heat it in the wintertime, it's going to become a full season place. Now, I think that you're really swimming up current here, trying to make a single pane, full glass area into a full season heated place. I think you have to make a decision about what you really want to do with that room. And, you know, it could very well be, I mean, if you're going to go to the problem of replacing windows, you know, it could be that maybe you need to really build some walls in this room and insulate those walls to a higher degree, and eliminate some of the glass, still have the, you know, the visual or the, you know, it's kind of comfort that you've had there in the past. But I think that it's a really hard lift to think that.
What's in the
exactly. Yeah. Right. You know, going back to the R value, what Matt was sort of saying, glass is up, you know, even the best glass in the world, triple pane out of, you know, Abu Dhabi or wherever we get that stuff, is not a very good R. Is it really weak? I don't know, R6 maybe, Matt, what's a triple pane 0.19 window?
R5 is a pretty darn good window.
Right. So going back to the code says minimum of R21 in a wall, right? So the best window you can get is R5. So you can sort of see one's like 4 times greater than the other. So maybe what you need to do if you really want to use that room for that use is redesign the whole thing, insulate everything that you can, design some ceiling insulations and sort of what Matt was sort of saying. And then think about bringing in the heat pump, because then you could actually have a space that could be air conditioned in the summer and heated in the winter to a really comfortable place. And you may not even have to air condition it in the summer. You just open a couple of the windows. Insulation keeps you warm in the winter and cool in the summer. And so this room has no insulation whatsoever now. And so to put a heat pump in there would be possibly frivolous.
You would just be pumping heat outdoors. Like
Yeah. So that would be my
great point.
Practical side. But
I would say, take a look at the whole thing.
Yeah.
What do we got in the floor? What do we got in the ceiling? What do the windows and walls look like? And then come up with a pathway to improve all areas, and then consider putting some heat out there. But first I would see what's the effect if we up our game in the thermal enclosure. How does that work? And then do we really need heat and cooling out there?
I have another meeting I have to cut away. This has been really pleasure. Great work with you, Matt, as always. Becca, you too. We'll talk to you guys later. Thanks everyone for chiming in, and happy Halloween. Don't forget to vote.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thanks, Bruce. And I'm blown away. We're still getting questions. My plan was to wrap up at 1. So I'm seeing a few more questions, but I think it's a good idea knowing that we've got Bruce who had to step away, and some of these questions might take a little bit more time. Let's hit this last question, and then I see we've got 2 more that I'll follow up with over email. So if you registered for this over email, I'll have that and we can respond that way. But yeah, quickly, Matt, we have a question from Mary Lou Sharp who says, should you and how do you insulate where pipes for heat or plumbing come through the floor?
Should you insulate where plumbing pipes come through the floor? So I assume we're talking about the floor from the basement. If it's a floor from a conditioned area, we don't necessarily need to insulate and air seal the little holes around the pipes where they penetrate through a wall. If it's a hole from an unconditioned area, like outside, or maybe an unconditioned crawl space or something, then yes, we should seal around them.
Great.
You want to go to the next question? We still got a couple minutes.
Yeah, we got a minute. So this will be our last question. So thank you everybody for joining. Lynn asks, we get mice in the house, our old farmhouse, a double old on that, I should note, they wrote, no doubt through the stone foundation, which is 1 inch above ground, and the walls of the basement. What is the best product to use to close up the inevitable house between those outdoor stones to stop the mice and to stay warmer?
Yeah, and again, that's like they're attracted to the warmth in the house, the shelter in your home. So that's what they're looking for. So if they can't sense that there's warmth, if we have an insulated, air sealed wall there, they can't sense what's going on the other side of that wall. There will be more tendency to leave it alone, although they're very, very hard to eradicate entirely. So yeah, insulating, air sealing that wall. I mean, work with your home performance contractor to find out what the best way forward is. We discussed a little bit about spray foaming and maybe putting a membrane down first so we don't mess up that wall in perpetuity. But again, that's where weatherization really, really helps on a number of different levels. So comfort, energy costs, and keeping the darn mice out of your house.
Well, on that note, I thank you so much, Matt. And Bruce, I'm sending out a big thank you to you as you are in your next meeting.
This was awesome.
Yes, and I just love the dynamic between the 2 of you. I think what's so great about the energy consultants at Efficiency Vermont and the team we have is that you just build off of each other. And so it's not, you both will think of different things that might be important when people think about projects. And I'll just underline that by saying, if you've got 2 experts that are bouncing off each other for ideas, I highly recommend, if you've got a specific situation in your home, to get resources, do your research, but also contact one of the Efficiency Excellency Network folks, one of our contractors on the Find a Contractor page, because they can help you get answers to those questions and make sure you're starting in the right place and getting quality work done. So again, I thank you. Thank you everyone for being a little goofy with us today. And I hope you have a happy Halloween. And I echo what Bruce said, we should all vote. And if you have an opportunity, please take a moment to check out the Button Up Vermont website and all sorts of resources from Efficiency Vermont. So thanks everybody.
Thanks, Becca. Great event. Thanks, Daniel. Nice costume.
Bye.